Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to this edition of AML Voices, our monthly webinar series. This month's topic is how adverse media monitoring can enhance your KYC and EDD effectiveness. I'm Elliot Berman from AML RightSource, and will be moderating today's live cast. We are recording today's session, and the recording will be posted on our website. So if you need to leave early or you like what you saw and you want to pass it on to a colleague, that'll be available. Chris Sindick and Jim Prestipino, two experts on this topic, are with me, and I'd like them to introduce themselves. Jim, would you start? And then Chris, can you do the same?
Sure. Thank you, Elliot. My name is Jim Prestipino. I'm the Director of Enhanced Due Diligence at Ally Bank. I've got 16 years of AML experience across sort of a broad spectrum. I started doing AML investigations and reviewing transaction activity, filing SARs. I then transitioned into operations. So at that point, I was doing more behind the scenes stuff. And I did 2 years as a sanctions manager. And for the last 6 years, I've been managing our enhanced due diligence team, as well as our adverse media monitoring program.
And hi, everyone. My name's Chris Sindick. I'm the Director of Third-Party Risk and Due Diligence here at Blue Umbrella. I've been in the industry of sort of third-party risk and compliance for about 15 or 20 years now. Done a lot of different things in my career, whether it's drafting policies and code of conduct, leading teams that write due diligence reports, and also managing teams that work on our own in-house offering when it comes to adverse media monitoring. So really seen a little bit of everything and really starting to see a lot more interest and activity when it comes to adverse media monitoring, or AMM, as you may hear us refer to it throughout this webinar, and based in Detroit, Michigan.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Chris. For those of you who are with us online, if you have questions for our experts, please type them into the Q&A box. We'll answer as many as we have time for. And now I think it's a good idea. Let's level set. So what is adverse media monitoring? Jim, you want to start with that?
Sure. To Chris's point a little bit earlier, I guess the first thing I would say is you might hear me say adverse media monitoring. You might hear me say AMM. You might hear me say negative news screening. There's many different ways to refer to this, but it's to answer your question, adverse media monitoring is essentially, in its simplest form, taking your customer information. So typically that's going to be customer name, age, and maybe address history, and running that name against hundreds, if not thousands, of curated news articles that are going to help you to identify if your customer is potentially engaging in or has engaged in some sort of financial crimes related negative news that might be outside of your institution's overall risk tolerance.
Yeah, and to complement on that, Jim, too, what in my role, we work not only with sort of financial institutions and banks, but corporates across a variety of industries, manufacturing, technology, consumer goods, what have you, too. So it's also looking at it in terms of all the different risks that are out there. A lot of companies still do an initial sort of an onboarding or a due diligence process, a screening, a sanctions check, etc. When they are first considering a relationship with a third party, be it a customer, supplier, distributor, agent, etc. And really, it's looking at that relationship as it changes over time and how that third party changes over time. Because sometimes if it is just that initial snapshot, it can become stale very quickly. And with the sort of information age that we're in now, that's good, but you definitely want to go through and find out if there's any new risks that you need to be aware of and act upon those accordingly. So it's that continually monitoring media sources. Obviously, there's other types that are out there to find out if there's any you have to be concerned with your business partners and customers.
So, Chris, you took us to kind of where the next topic is, and that is how does, excuse me, How does adverse media monitoring really fit into KYC and EDD? And Jim, I'm going to go back to you.
Sure.
Since you're leading the EDD processes at Ally. Why don't you start with EDD, and then the two of you can talk more generally about KYC.
Yeah, it's another sort of tool in the tool belt. It's another vector to get a line of sight into your customer or your prospective customer. We all, hopefully, for the bank and financial institution side of the house, have routines in place for transaction monitoring and customer risk scoring and sanctions and PEP screening. Even with all those tools in place, there's still a chance that you can miss something if your customer isn't acting or transacting in a way that's going to trigger that adverse media review. So by having continuous adverse media monitoring, you're going to be able to identify activity that you may not be able to find transactionally within your institution. It's just going to give you a better overview of your customer and help you sort of determine what to do with that customer as far as, do I need to risk rate them high or very high? Do I need to do more continuous monitoring? Do I need to consider exiting that relationship? Or if it's a prospective customer, maybe rejecting that application.
Chris?
Yeah, I think about it too a lot of times, and the way I've heard our clients and our potential clients think about it is sort of in reverse of if there was a serious government investigation or an enforcement action or inquiry. That's obviously that is something everyone wants to avoid naturally. So if they come knocking for one reason or another, what can you do to support your program along the way? And a lot of times that's based on the bedrock of government guidance. I think one of the documents that a lot of compliance practitioners and those that are affiliated with doing these types of checks look at is the evaluation of corporate compliance programs that was released by the DOJ Criminal Division, which is constantly being updated. And one of the lines in there that's really important is that ongoing monitoring is a factor when they're evaluating a program. Ongoing monitoring, those exact words are being used. So if it's something that's important to a government regulator that's going to be evaluating your program, again, if something goes wrong, it's definitely be important to us in the industry and those that are running programs as well. So again, there's that snapshot that takes place at various points in a relationship with a third party or a customer. But what we've seen is that that's not always sufficient to have that and say, well, they were good 6 months ago, a year ago, and kind of put it out of sight, out of mind. So I really think it's going beyond check the box to really trying to turn that into something that's an operational efficiency to identify those things early and act upon them so they don't cause harm to your business ultimately.
And I think KYC, when the concept first really became a routine, was really more about initial onboarding. And so it was, and this is at a time when adverse media monitoring really didn't exist in any form that we use it today, but it was a snapshot. Do I know who I'm about to, start doing business with? Now, both EDD as it relates to high-risk customer reviews, but also some kind of ongoing, what's my customer doing? Is it the same customer, if you will, that I onboarded? I may have risk rated them or scored them in some way when they came on board. And now I need, if on the bank side and on the corporate side, when I engaged with this vendor, they fit into a certain risk parameter. How do I assess how that's changed? And so, EDD is I don't want to say a more routine. It's I think the regulators, at least on the bank side, definitely look at it as a pretty particular, periodic, risk rating driven process. But knowing who your customer is, so some bank does personal business with the mayor of New York. I think last night's announcements that showed up in the media are causing someone to go, what should we be doing about that? Now, probably not taking any action. An indictment is not, is only the government's view of what they think they can prove. But that's way different than he went to a cocktail party last night showing up in the media. And so, I think people need to sort of keep that perspective. So, are there liability issues in using AMM? Jim, what do you think?
So, excuse me. When I think about liability issues as it pertains to AMM, I think of it more in the regarding whether or not we're going to demarket or choose not to onboard a customer based on adverse media that we identified. And so I think it's important that you have documented criteria to determine, once you receive that adverse media, how do you sort of interpret it, and what action do you take once you do identify that adverse media. And so it's good to have some sort of, obviously there's going to be adverse media that exceeds sort of the overall risk tolerance for an institution from time to time. So you should have a routine in place where you're escalating these customers. Maybe it's with your BSA officer or your deputy BSA officer or head of investigations, whoever that appropriate group of stakeholders is, but have a routine, have it documented. To your point, Elliot, have a structure that says indictments, charges, accusations. These aren't going to necessarily 9 times out of 10 bubble up to the point where I consider demarketing the customer, but a conviction, sentencing, a guilty plea, that's a different story. So you need to make sure that the news is sort of airtight. You need to make sure that it is your customer, right? You need to make sure that the person in this adverse media is in fact our customer or prospective customer. And there's a balancing act between, like anything. Do I want the liability of having of sort of mislabeling a customer and preventing someone from being on board that wasn't actually named in the negative news, or do I want the risk of having that person come into my bank? So there's definitely a little bit of a balancing act there.
Yeah, and I think it'd be really interesting too, using AMM a lot of times is sort of, the word on the street, if you will, where you have the questionnaires that are, administered to customers and third parties. There's, obviously the government databases that you can check, criminal, whatever it might be too. But sometimes it's sort of, hey, have you heard of Chris? How does he operate? How does he do business? And that can be really difficult to get to. And AMM can be, a way to sort of, find the buzz, if you will, and trigger off maybe a little bit more of a serious investigation. If there are allegations in the media, I think that's one of the things, Jim, that you touched upon, where a lot of times it's sort of allegations, it's rumor, it's conjecture, it's, hey, I've heard, or an NGO may release a report that a company's doing something they shouldn't. It hasn't reached that realm of a government action just yet, or an investigation, but it's enough to raise some eyebrows and say, maybe we should find out a little bit more, or follow up. That's probably a good way to direct our resources. So I think that's certainly one of the liability issues that's raised, and I think thinking about it from a different perspective too at the same time, for companies that are thinking about doing AMM and getting started with it. They may have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of customers, and to suddenly turn that on one day, a lot of news out there. So if you're flicking the switch and, hey, we got 5 articles on everyone, and maybe there's some very common names that are there, you may be faced with 1 million hits, and that's a lot to work through. So a liability perhaps is to be inundated with a bunch of information that then you have to remediate, in doing that in a way that is defensible at the end of the day, because if you find something, you have to deal with it. So I think that's one of the main considerations companies should think about too.
Yeah, and we got a question in the Q&A that I think bleeds right into what you're talking about, Chris. And I'll just read it. Do FIs or fintechs do negative news screening at enrollment or when triggered for high risk? Seems to be cumbersome to screen 100,000 enrollments a month.
Yeah, maybe I'll have the mic and I'll pass over to Jim. But yeah, a lot of times it's aligning with the resources you have. Hey, if you have 200 people that are there on a daily basis, looking through things, screening them out. Probably have a good bandwidth there to look at, a pretty wide population. But if it's sort of a, one person army, it's a very different situation there at the same time. So it really just depends on the resources and, what you can effectively manage on a day to day. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I would piggyback on that and say, I think it's going to depend on your institution, and to some extent, it's going to depend on the business line or the products involved. And as always, you have to take a risk-based approach. I think we'll talk a little bit more depth, about who to screen. But as far as is there a requirement to screen everybody at onboarding? No, I don't think so. But I think you do have to sort of determine based on other factors like the business line, like the product, like potential nexus to a specific high-risk geography. It may be prudent to screen those types of customers at onboarding.
Yeah, and in so many situations, it's taking that risk-based approach. If you can fall back on that, I think you're generally in good hands.
Agreed.
Agreed. So let's talk a little bit about the decision-making process in the, selecting a tool or selecting a process, what the tool would be, and sort of what's involved in implementation. So how do you select a tool? And I guess I'm thinking, when adverse media monitoring or negative news screening began, there weren't curated tools. And so there were search engines, and, people would say, oh yeah, I'm running everything through Google. And I'm, the cool thing is it looks everywhere. The bad news is it looks everywhere. So, Jim, in your experience, what are the positives or negatives, or how do you decide whether you use a curated tool versus more general internet searching?
Yeah, great question. Like I said, I've been doing AML for 16 years, so I'm old enough to remember, when all we had were Google searches. And like you said, when you do a Google search, you're casting a very wide net, so you're getting everything. So not just necessarily news articles, but you're getting social media, you're getting anything that might be related to that name. You don't know that you're getting legitimate sources, like we touched on a little bit earlier, Chris. The good thing and bad thing about the world we live in today is everybody has a voice, everybody has a way to put their opinion online. And so, are you getting legitimate news sources, or are you getting some creep in his mom's basement who just has an opinion about a certain person and they're just putting it online? Sometimes it's hard to differentiate. Is the negative news, if you are fortunate enough and you find negative news, is it even our customer, or is it just someone with a very similar name and perhaps a very similar profile? Another thing with Google is, how many pages deep do I need to go to feel like I did an adequate search? We did a test a few years ago, not necessarily related to AMM, but just comparing different search engines, and even the same search engine with the same search criteria, and saying, are we going to get the same output in each search engine? If I run a Google search on a name on my laptop versus a peer's, we would see different results. So you're not guaranteed to get all the top hits that you want. Do I need to do different keyword searches? Do I need to do the name plus the city and state plus keywords like conviction, negative, money laundering, things like that? And so some of the benefits of using a screening tool is it filters out a lot of that noise. I know there's a million different vendors out there, and I don't know if I said this at the onset, but we do use a third party for our adverse media monitoring. But you're starting at a place where you have confidence that the output that you're getting, the sources that are being curated, are legitimate and are reasonable. You're also selecting the categories of risk that you specifically are targeting. So, we have, depending on the type of customer that we're screening, up to 30 different categories of risk that we screen against. And obviously money laundering, fraud, terrorist financing are sort of our big three. But by having those sort of filters in place, we're not going to see information about a DUI or, somebody losing their medical license. Well, that's not great, but it's not a financial crimes or a high AML risk. it's going to clear, a lot of these vendors will have some sort of a triage process in place, or, I don't want to get too deep into technology because that's not my lane, but a lot of these vendors have AI and machine learning in place now where it goes through that first sort of filtering scheme where it says, I want to see this type of customer. And then it will parse it down even further to say, these are going to be more material, more likely matches that then my team will get to look at. So I think the benefit of a AMM program is, again, you're getting cleaner data, you're getting more hopefully accurate data and more sort of concentrated data based on the categories of risk that you're specifically targeting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the kind of the original question to think about it too, how do you select a tool? There are numbers of vendors out there. Certainly, we have one at Blue Umbrella too at the same time, and I think it's giving them a few names, doing a test drive and seeing what comes back, especially looking at types of third parties and customers with extremely different levels of exposure. Sort of someone that's in the headlines and then someone that's, very low profile, and seeing exactly how those are presented, a very unique name perhaps, and then a very common name, and seeing how those match up. At the end of the day, and looking at different geographies too, I think is really important. If for example, you have a large base of your third parties in Brazil or Mexico or China versus the US, France, UK, it can be very different. The quality of results from one region to the next. I use and my team uses a lot of Google in our role with due diligence research, and as was noted, depending where you are, where you're sitting, doing the Googling, it can make a big difference on the impact too. So looking at those sort of differentiators from one to the next, I think is a big factor as well. I think another key decision to make, perhaps early on or when you start to see the scope of the findings you're going to get, is to consider whether you want to keep it in-house or, outsource the review of the hits as well, if it's something that your team can manage, or if the vendor in particular needs to go through and do some false positive screenings or weed out irrelevant results, different things like that. And two, looking at the scope of risk that you're concerned about. Is it cybersecurity? Is it surveillance? Is it human rights? Bribery and corruption. Certain things are going to be baseline standards, but if you are looking at a more niche, more narrowed down range of topics, how well those are covered from one tool to the next. And do you want to cover things like social media? Do you want to see TikTok videos in your AMM results? I'll explain what TikTok is to you later, Elliot. Just kidding. But with that, it's a matter of just going through and seeing if what is being covered and what's being included is too much or too little. So I think a test drive is really good, and obviously looking at some of just the basic scope coverage along the way.
Yeah, and Chris, if I could just kind of piggyback on that as well, you brought up a great point of sort of comparing and contrasting different services. And when we decided to do AMM, we did a proof of concept with I think 4 different vendors. And for those who aren't currently doing AMM but are interested, reach the information's out there. You can find them. They're all going to be happy to hear from you. And what we were able to do was take a sample of customers and run them in these different services, these different providers, and kind of compare and contrast the output. Were we getting better output in one versus the other? The other things that you want to consider is for different vendors, how easy is it going to be to integrate that tool, that vendor into your sort of existing systems? The other thing that you also want to consider is the customer service that's provided by the vendor. Are you getting everything that you need? Are they responsive? If there's an outage, are they able to quickly respond? If you're identifying adverse media, maybe you're still, you're doing AMM, but you're also doing supplemental Google searches, maybe out of an abundance of caution. And if you find something that the service didn't find, it's like, how do you, how can they reconcile that? Are they providing data reporting and metrics to show you your hit rate and your false positive rate? Do they have established maybe monthly or quarterly governance routines to show you overall screening volumes and output and things like that. So I think there's a lot to be considered when choosing a vendor outside of just obviously quality and cost. I don't think I mentioned cost. They're not cheap. I mean, most of the time, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. It's not inexpensive, but it's in some cases it's a necessary device.
I think the other part of the expense equation is there's an efficiency to using the curated tools versus, however many people it is that are using the more general internet search tools, because as you both discussed, the quality of the results has to be dealt with. And if you get a lot of what I'll call false positives, or at least things that have to be further explored in depth, that takes up human time. So if the vendor's providing the human time, baking that into the price, of course, to curate the sources, and in some cases even give you only return results that meet your risk criteria, that's a factor. It's hard to make those apples to apples from a cost, but it's not, well, Google's free and a tool costs. It's much more
Sure.
than that. And I think that's important. So the next question is, so now you've figured out kind of what your selection process would be. And I appreciate both of you talking about the test drive. I'm going to add one more to that. And that is, everybody in this business has colleagues that they trust who are at different points in the arc of new systems and things like that. And another good source is talk to your friends in the business and see if they've adopted, because they may have already done some of the legwork, at least to say, well, we looked at 10 systems and we got it down to 3. And you may be in a position where you could take advantage of that and that knowledge, at least bringing your own personal knowledge up to speed. But once you make the decision, what are the challenges in actually bringing a product into, or a search tool into production? And I guess the things that go into that, obviously you've got, Jim, you mentioned you have got to integrate it into your current processes. You've got to deal with IT infrastructure, and you have to figure out who to monitor. But how do you make all those things happen in a reasonable time period so you can actually get from we've got budget approval to it's really helping us?
Yeah, it's not necessarily always an easy and quick process when you're dealing with multiple stakeholders and different IT teams and technology, as you know. But as far as things that we consider when we're adding this to an existing process, you have to think about obviously who you want to screen, but what is the frequency that you're screening these customers or these potential customers? Is it going to be a daily or a nightly screen? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Are there certain times of the week or certain times of the month where you might get an increased volume? Maybe if you're doing like retail auto contracts at onboarding, for example, maybe you're going to have a pop on the weekend so that Monday someone's going to come in and have a lot of output waiting for them. Who works that output? So, when we first started doing our AMM screening, it kind of made sense to align it with the sanctions and watch list screening tool, because they were the sort of experts on customer screening. As it sort of matured and we became more accustomed to what we were doing, we said maybe it is more appropriately anchored to EDD, because at the end of the day, EDD is going to be the subject matter experts on customer risks. But where does it sit? Do you have, to Chris's point about, should it be outsourced? Do you have the necessary staffing that you need, or do you need to consider adding staff or adding contractors? Is there a QC or QA process that needs to be implemented? Because someone's, looking at these alerts and saying they're true matches or false positives. Do we need a second set of eyes to sort of confirm that? Anytime you add a new system, and again, we use a vendor, and so they have a alert management tool where we work the output. There needs to be some systems training. Our analysts need to know where to find the information, how to disposition it, and then it also requires internal training as far as putting together job aids and guidance. You see this negative news, what do you do with it? Having like kind of a matrix say, if this, then that. When to escalate it further, when to recommend closure, things like that. Are there procedures that need to be updated, right? At a minimum, you're going to have to put together your, again, in my world, it's the EDD. So we have our adverse media procedures and process guides. What other procedures throughout the enterprise need to be updated? Maybe your CDD, maybe business line procedures. So you have to figure all that out. If you're saving supporting documentation to say, this is not our customer or this is our customer, what supporting documentation is appropriate and necessary. And if it's, something big like a LexisNexis person in PDF, where do you save that? So there's a lot to be considered from a sort of process standpoint. As far as, the IT infrastructure, we touched on a little bit, but you're transmitting customer data, right? You're sharing customer data with the third party in most cases. And so, the most important thing there is you want to make sure that there are security and controls in place, that you're not compromising customer data. You don't want to have some sort of a breach. So are there guardrails on both sides so that there aren't, potential issues involving customer data? And, how many different sort of systems are involved? So, we screen at my bank, we screen all customers across the enterprise. And so not every customer is going to be identified in the same system of record. So you might have multiple, you might have an auto system, a deposit system, a mortgage. So how many different systems are going to be feeding into this? So that's where, you have to have a close partnership with your IT and your operations teams to sort of, thankfully, they're the ones who sort of work through the technical side of the house. And I do more of the procedural side that I kind of initially mentioned. But there's always a lot of people at the table making these, because there's a lot to it. It's not just one analyst clearing an alert and that's that. There's multiple moving parts involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, Jim, obviously you've gone through the process. So, it's interesting to hear a lot of those, sort of stories and lessons that you learned along the way, and how it's done on our side too, on the vendor side that often does these things. Sometimes the challenges, or as we call them, opportunities, that present themselves are things that, sometimes clients are, maybe they didn't fully anticipate, just with the use case for what they've had, and what they've prepared for. One example that I can point to is sometimes you may follow, or you may have need to screen a company that has a very significant enforcement action underway. So, the company was convicted of, $1 million or $1 billion fine. So you're going to get thousands of potential hits on that company and the individuals involved, and that can create sort of a tidal wave. Wow, we have 10 times the amount of hits that we had the day before. Which source do we actually want to use with that, so we're not reviewing the same type of hit over and over again? Or if there's sort of a major, again, action with one of the third parties or customers that you're screening, it kind of, you may get small irrelevant updates for weeks about that at the same time too, where, okay, there was a motion filed to delay the case. Okay, well, a new attorney's on it, or it's changed, whatever it might be that relates to the case. It's true, but you just don't care about it. You need to go through, you need to wait for something that is, actually going to cause you to, have action of some kind or another. So I think it's those sort of configurations along the way that need to be considered. So again, what you've planned, what you've tested for, matches the resource that you have. Two, looking at, what happens if you load in a very common name. For example, if you're working with client whose name is George Bush, or Bill Clinton, or any other sort of celebrity, for example, Brad Pitt. Okay, well, you're going to get a bunch of these sort of articles and things that are, again, not terribly relevant for you, that you need to deal with. So that false positive factor is really big. So, anything that you can do to have, secondary identifiers, smart technology too, that can actually move some of these things out, is a huge consideration. And also, as you had mentioned too, make sure the business is prepared to act on these, because the end goal is not to gather a bunch of information. The end goal is to find risks that you can act upon to create value for your business. So if someone is, there's a legitimate hit of a serious nature in the media, making sure that that's going to be taken seriously, too, I think is a big part of it as well, because if it's just, oh, well, there's an article in, some Egyptian newspaper I've never heard of, what does it matter to us over here in Detroit? You got to have that buy-in that this is a legitimate process along the way. So again, kind of using that in the risk-based approach in a way that makes sense to the organization.
There was a question earlier that I haven't thrown at you, but I'm going to do it now because I think it fits with some of the things you've been talking about. And that is, what are either of you seeing in terms of the use, and Jim, you mentioned this in passing, of artificial intelligence to sharpen the focus of, I'll say, what you get in a return when you're searching on either Brad Pitt or Elliot Berman, and I'm not nearly as famous as Brad, so you won't
Not
get
yet.
Close.
Yeah, well, I have one of those Google alert searches running on my own name, and what I found out is there's a lot of Elliot Bermans, and it's rarely me. So,
Mhm.
so are you seeing AI tools starting to be deployed by either the vendors or yourself if you're deploying AI internally and running the results that you get from the vendor through an AI process?
So I don't know if I mentioned this earlier. So Ally is online. For those who don't know, it's an online bank. It's primarily a domestic only online bank. And we don't bank businesses. At least we don't bank their operational accounts. So it's mostly consumer retail customers. And so, like Elliot, or Chris, when I hear you talking about thousands of alerts, fortunately, we don't really have that problem at Ally. But as far as artificial intelligence being used to sort of clean up a lot of that, we aren't using it today. But the vendor that we use, we've demoed their AI product. It's something that we strongly considered it, but we determined right now is not the right time. But it's certainly something that it came up the last time we were talking during our sort of annual touch point where we sit with them and they tell us about their new products, and it sounds something like that. It's very interesting, but it's not something that we've started doing yet. But I think it's probably it's the future, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in terms of what AI can do for us and what it can do for you, it's it's really kind of the number one sort of buzzword in the industry right now, and honestly, I think it's a really good use. Yeah, we're an industry that's a good use case for it. Lots of semi-structured data, continuously being fed into a system, open source information a lot of times too. So we're like the poster children for what AI can do. So yes, vendors in this space are using it. We're using it, and it can do a number of things. One of the most I think clear ways about it is false positives, where you get rid of the Brad Pitt, the actor. A lot of times that kind of straddles the line between is it AI or just good filtering, and good relevancy scores at the same time. But it's also looking at the information on the output on the client facing side to say, what are we giving them? Okay, if it's a 5,000 word article and it's a 2 or 3 word sort of summary, I think we're looking at something better than that. When did it happen? What courts were involved? At what stage is it in? Who are the other actors? What are the seriousness of the allegations? What type? Different things like that to just make sure that the time is being used, the most efficient way possible too. I think too, just integration into other systems as well. If this, then where? Then where does it go, and who acts upon that in an intelligent manner, and getting it to the person that needs it the most. If it is sort of a compliance analyst that's reviewing this, there's a lot of steps to get it from article was posted online, it was scraped up, it's qualified, it's categorized, and then taking it where it needs to be. So I think flattening that and getting the turnaround time on those even better. It makes a lot of sense. And two, just the governance around AI. with great power comes great responsibility, and it's certainly very powerful. So making sure that it's done in a way that doesn't cast too wide of a net and doesn't narrow things down to the point where you're missing things too. So I won't say it's a wait and see approach, because we're beyond that. It's here now, but I think having guardrails around that to where you're comfortable with what it's doing for you at the end of the day. AI is not taking the job yet, but it's another way to help make everyone's quality of life a little bit better, hopefully.
Yeah, my view of AI generally in this whole space, not just AMM, is it's going to be helpful if it can get better quality information to the human beings who have to execute judgment. Because so far, I haven't seen an AI tool that really has human judgment, and there's an awful lot of subtlety in a lot of what we do in terms of how we risk score and those kinds of things. And it's not just stick it in the top and get a number and 100% comfort at the bottom that it's figured out what's going on. But it can be a great tool to improve the quality of, and particularly, as you mentioned, false positives. So
and I think one more point on that, Elliot, sorry to interrupt, but I think is also helping with the translations along the way as well. I think that's another really interesting use case too. Sometimes it's, it might be English only that the AI is good at, that's where it can interpret things, but looking at it in Mandarin, Spanish, French, Turkish, all these different things that can be done, because that might be where the risk lies, but it's only an English speaker on the other end. So I think having that kind of connection between different languages, painting that picture across time too, with lots of different articles coming through, might be another really interesting use case, considering the global nature of these AMM programs too.
And I'm glad you brought that up. We had a question come in just a few moments ago about, and I'll just read it. We use LexisNexis, and sometimes the negative news comes back in other languages for searches done in English. Why does this happen? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I think the idea of having tools that can then take returns and do something with them, so you can decide, is it noise? How did the LexisNexis obviously searches a very broad database of sources, some of which do not appear in English. And so I think AI, as you pointed out, is a really good use case for that. In terms of why LexisNexis does that, that's probably a question for your LexisNexis rep rather than us. But it's a real serious thing. And as you point out, Chris, commerce is global, risk is global, and so you can't just live with it the way it is.
I've read more due diligence reports than I've had hot dinners, and the amount of times that I've clicked on a link for a source material, and it's not in English. It's up there too, and it's really stress inducing when that happens, where okay, I'm not, what's the latest on this? I want to read the source material. It's something serious. And you look at it and you're just like, geez, I can use translate, but I'm not quite sure. And there's a lot of nuance here. Maybe it's just like a PDF that can't be easily converted to, again, that's where technology can come in and help.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked a lot about selection challenges and bringing the systems online. And we've talked about some of this next part too, but I want to focus in particular. So once you have AMM in production, I want to dig a little bit into how do you evaluate the output? Because as you both pointed out, depending on what tool you're using and time of the month, all different kinds of things, you can suddenly have a pretty big pile of returns, and you have to deal with that. So one of my questions is, how do you get comfortable that you're even looking, that the return is from a reliable source? So if it comes from I'm going to be simplistic, comes from Financial Times, New York Times, things like that, you're going to feel, okay, this is likely not rumor. This has been reviewed in some way. People have some standards in creating the information, and it doesn't get into the information stream without some review on the producer end. But there's a lot of information sources. I'm going to avoid calling them news sources, information sources that probably are not real reliable. So how are you dealing with, or how do you filter that kind of how do you filter through that kind of challenge? Jim?
Yeah. So, like I said a little bit earlier, we are fortunate that we do use a vendor, and so a lot of the news articles and the sources that they will return to us they have some sort of a vetting process. So we're getting what we believe to be good quality sources. But back to what we talked about with Google, where you're casting that wide net, if you find something and it is sort of a unknown or a source that's less reputable than like the Washington Post or some of the ones that you mentioned, it's a balance. You have to consider it, and determine, what am I going to do with this information? How valid is it? How legitimate is it? So it might be a factor in your overall sort of risk determination, but I don't think, if it's some unknown source and it's a one-off and you can't verify it or validate it with any better known sources, then I think you have to kind of take that for what it's worth and take it with a bit of a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've heard some stories too about parody sites sometimes getting scooped up in AMM, where it's the Onion type of articles, which are just pure satire. And obviously, when one of those comes through, you may have a chuckle. It's so outrageous that it's easily discarded. You can blacklist certain sites too. Hey, we're not going to get anything from news outlet XYZ because we know it's heavily politically skewed at the same time. That's where a lot of sort of on the grounds analysts that know the region, know the sources, can provide some input into it. They say there's a seed of truth in every rumor. Not always the case too, but that's something where just having some context behind it and following up and kicking off maybe a larger examination of that is worthwhile, because again, even if it's not 100% reliable or it's an unknown source, it's arriving to you. It's going through and saying, this is a potential risk, here's a finding, and there's a record now that you were made aware of that. So depending what it turns into, and all the things that can go wrong along the way, just having a defensible tactics behind that, I think is really important too. But the technology, just giving it the keys to the system, no one's doing that, or they shouldn't be doing that. Having that human interaction to come in and make some of those judgment calls where needed is really a necessary part of the process, especially early on, to make sure that you're on solid footing.
We had a question come in. How do you think AMM can be improved to handle emerging financial crime techniques like synthetic identities or fraud using dormant accounts? So I guess I'll preface your answers with, again, this is a tool, and I don't know that it's specifically designed with the idea that it's going to help with those. Maybe more somewhat on the synthetic identity side, but I don't know that it's going to, in my view, and I'm not actively, using a tool. I'm not. It's a little harder to see how it's going to help with dormant accounts, but I would turn it. Maybe Jim, why don't you take a crack at that if you don't mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of goes along with the criteria you're using when you're selecting a vendor. Do they have are they nimble and able to add, whether there's new red flags or typologies that are emerging, are they able to sort of quickly respond and put in additional categories of risk that can sort of identify these new triggers?
It reminds me of a story I heard a while ago where there was I think it was an artist in California, and as a way to sort of do this social experiment, what they did was they got all these old phones and had GPS on them, and they put about 1,000, 500 of these phones in a wagon. And they just kind of rolled them down a street. And the algorithm, with GPS tracking at the time, recognized that as a massive traffic jam. And all the cars in the areas were told to avoid that. It shut it down. It was a red street, basically, if you're familiar with kind of Google Maps or Waze, whichever one you use. So I think that I'm sure that they came up with a way to get around that over time, and I think that once companies start to see that, and partnering with their vendor, their technology vendors, to know that it's happening first of all, and then two, leaving it up to the technology geniuses out there to find a way to make sense of it all, and make sure that there's actually 1,000 cars on the road and not 1,000 phones in a red wagon.
So we're coming toward the end of our hour, and there's one more piece in the production side that I want to talk about, and that's governance. So just for a couple minutes, let's talk about what triggers a decision to exit a client or retain a client based on, AMM return. And then, yeah, in those, and I know, Chris, in your world, you're not filing SARs, but uh, what might trigger a decision to file a SAR, which doesn't mean you're exiting a customer. Most SARs, I think, that are filed, and there's a lot of them these days, are not directly tied to a client exit event. And so, if you can sort of talk to each of those, Chris, why don't you start? I realize the SAR part is
Mhm.
not true, but
No, it's fine, but still, basically, what needs to happen to say, okay, we need to pull the plug on this potential relationship. I think there are some types of headlines that are so bombastic that it's hard to retain, particular third party, even if it is only rumors at that point. And the imagination can run wild with what that might be. But then it's that gray area in life that often gets us into trouble. And I think those are the situations where, okay, it might be allegations in the media. Again, to a point I made before, is that there might be a seed of truth with some of those, and following up with it as appropriate. Seeing, maybe talking to that individual or that third party that's involved to say, how do you respond to this allegation? And typically there's a lot of other things that are happening, and a lot of facts, and even a lot more progress that are happening behind the scenes and what's reported in the media too. So, thinking again backwards from that worst case scenario, say you offboard a client or a company, and then they sue you and say you had no reason to do that, making sure that it's based in fact, or reasonableness to do so, and having a lot of the policy and the documentation, and maybe in the support of outside counsel sometime to make that decision.
Jim?
Yeah. So, from more of the consumer banking side, if we're going to recommend exiting a customer based on negative news or adverse media, there's definitely a few things that we want to consider. And again, it goes back to what stage are we in the legal process? If there are charges, accusations, rumors, that might be more of a, hey, maybe we need to file a SAR versus we should think about exiting this customer. If it's a conviction, guilty plea, sentencing, that's sort of like the first thing we want to see. What was the nature of the negative news? Obviously, it probably will be related to money laundering or fraud or terrorist financing. What was the dollar amount involved? That's going to drive whether or not we want to retain this customer. How long ago did it occur? Is it very recent? With the AMM continuous monitoring, we'll see it in real time, but we also do have instances where we do kind of a broader look back. So if this is something that happened 20 years ago, we are less likely to exit that relationship if nothing else has occurred in that span. What was the client's role in the adverse media? Sometimes they may be the sort of ringleader, the head of this crime, and other times they might just be one of many if it's like a drug trafficking ring. And so you look at those a little bit differently depending on their actual role. As far as SAR filing, Elliot, so my team is not the team that's responsible for filing SARs, but I do work very closely with my peer on the AML investigations side. And we always have a very open line of communication both ways with referrals. And the one of the advantages of adverse media monitoring is you may be looking at transactional activity that on the surface looks, maybe it was flagged in your transaction monitoring tool. An investigator looked at it and it looks like normal activity for that customer. Well, that's in the absence of the adverse media. Once the adverse media is identified, that might change your perspective. And now it's like, okay, the activity that we thought was normal may not be normal. Maybe the proceeds of this crime that we just read about. And so, I don't know all the criteria that's used for them to determine if a SAR should or should not be filed, but I know we do identify potentially suspicious or what we would call, high risk transaction activity that we do refer to that team based on the scope of the adverse media that we find.
And the adverse media returns and your decision to say this is enough that I at least need to send it over to add it to their pile is just another factor or set of factors in a broad mosaic about deciding whether or not to exit a customer or a SAR. I'm not saying that you'd never do it just from an AMM return, but usually if there's an AMM return, there are other things going on. And as you just pointed out, Jim, it helps put the puzzle together. Sure. So we've got 4 minutes left. I want to give each of you about a minute to give our audience 3 key takeaways that you want them to remember from this session. So Chris, why don't you go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think, there's a lot, here. Condensing down 60 minutes into one is always fun. But, I think one of the takeaways is definitely, there's a lot of support in looking at ongoing monitoring. A lot of times that's thought about with sanctions, sort of the baseline type of monitoring that's done. But this adverse media monitoring and even beneficial media monitoring, finding out, different things about your clients that could benefit you, good things too. Hey, we focus on the negative in life, but, it can really help to provide some dividends around, down the road. A lot of times this can be a reactive industry. And I think that's something that people get criticized for a lot. But hey, this is something you can point to and say we're being very proactive. We're finding out about it as soon as we can. We're trying to prevent things along the way. So I think that it's, there's a lot of strong evidence out there for supporting ongoing monitoring, and this is one way to do it. Another one is start small. If you have a lot of customers or third parties and it doesn't seem like it's going to, you're overwhelmed by that, look at a high risk portion, go there, make sure it's fit and expand it over time. And then the third one is if you're worried that you don't have the resources yourself, there are partners out there to help. Technology can help to, bridge the gap between resources you have and resources you don't have. And that's a good way to have technology work for you at the same time. So it doesn't always have to be in-house too. Jim?
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering when we first started this, how the heck are we going to fill an hour talking about adverse media monitoring? And here we are. I'm like, we could go on for another hour probably. So this has been great. My takeaways are, like we said earlier, adverse media monitoring is another piece of the puzzle. It's another glimpse into your customer. And so assuming that you start small, like Chris, like you said, and maybe you're focusing on your known high-risk customer population, assuming you're on some sort of a periodic cadence of a year, 18 months, if something happens today and you're not scheduled to look at that customer again for another 16 months, that's just going to sit there dormant for that long. So having adverse media monitoring, it does a great job of sort of bridging that gap in between periodic review cycles. And so you're going to be able to get information in real time to help you make a decision of, do I need to increase this customer's risk rating? Do we need to potentially file a SAR? Do we need to consider exiting this customer? I will say, just from my experience, adverse media has been a really strong source for us. We of our high-risk customer population, which thankfully is very small, nearly 30% of those customers are high risk because of adverse media. Whether it was the adverse media identified first and or there was some other reason and then we identified the adverse media after that. Either way, it's a large portion of our high risk customer base. So I do think it's incredibly valuable. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of people involved in AMM, from your technology team, your EDD team, perhaps your screening team, your program team. So just make sure you have adequate documentation outlining your methodology, roles and responsibilities, and again, that criteria for how you would sort of disambiguate or risk rate each type of adverse media. And then the last thing I would say is if you are choosing to do this and go with the vendor, make sure that you're choosing a vendor that's going to give you everything that you are asking for, that they are able to minimize false positives. You don't want those thousands of alerts like Chris mentioned earlier, that they have a process that easily integrates with your systems, and that they provide you with the support that you need.
Jim and Chris, thank you very much for sharing your expertise, and I want to thank our audience for joining us today. Our next edition of AML Voices will be live streamed on October 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and our topic will be, is fraud the new AML? My colleague Chuck Taylor is going to moderate that session, and it's going to focus on the evolving regulatory expectations about how fraud prevention programs should be structured and implemented. And you can register for that session at our website, amlrightsource.com. If you're looking for more information about financial crime prevention, you can go to the resource tabs on our website. And if you'd like us to help you with your challenges in this space with your third party risk management program, please contact us. So thanks again for joining us, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.